Thank you very much. I think it's time's moving so fast. It's reached to nearly 12 o'clock already. So we have around 30 minutes, including question and answer. So let me go straight to the points of the panel session 3. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Puthsodary, a moderator for panel session 3. On behalf of the team, I would like to introduce a brief biography of our distinguished speakers who will be presenting Chapter 4 and Chapter 7 of the book. So, given the Chapter 7, let me introduce Professor Sujiro Urata. He is the Professor Emeritus at Waseda University and Senior Research Advisor at the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia area. Faculty Fellow at the Research Institute of Economic, Trade, Industry. Specially appointed Fellow at Japanese Center for Economic Research. Researcher at Asian Development Bank Institute. He specialized in international economic and has extensive publications, a number of books and journals on international economic issues. The second speaker, Dr. Dionysius Najoko, is currently working as the senior economic at ERIA. His research covers industrialization in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, economic integration in Asian and East Asia, focusing on the Asian economic community, blueprint, and regional economic architectures. The topic in economic development, such as small and medium enterprises and international relationship between human capital and economic growth. The third speaker today is Professor Sandre Morgan Tenkagulu. It's already introduced by our panel already. The topic to discuss today is about the post-COVID-19 and also post-pandemic recovery in East Asia. So the floor is to Professor Sujiro Urata. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And I'm presenting a paper which I've written with Doni Naorjoko and Chandre Sangabalu, as I introduced. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizer for giving me this opportunity to present this paper. Let me share the screen. I hope you can see this slide. And given the time constraint, I'd like to first of all make a very important point. That is the RCEP is a very important framework. Let's see. Oops, sorry. Oh, I don't know what. I'm sorry that I pushed something that I shouldn't have. Okay. It's a very important framework for open regionalism and set the momentum for global trade and investment during the COVID-19 pandemic shock. And this is a message that we'd like to get across to you. And in this paper, we first identified important or serious challenges that are faced by ASEAN and East Asian countries. And then we'd like to argue that RCEP is a very important and very useful and very effective framework to deal with these challenges. And first, I'd like to identify 5 key elements of RCEP. One is rule-based trade and investment, market access, economic cooperation, ASEAN centrality, and living agreement. These are the key elements which have been discussed already, but we just like to repeat the importance of these key elements with the RCEP. And these 5 key elements play a very important role in dealing with the challenges that I'll be discussing. First, here we identify 3 challenges. Of course, there are more challenges, as we heard earlier, but here we'd like to point out the 3 of them: US-China trade war, and rising anti-globalization, and COVID. I guess these are 3 important or very serious challenges faced by ASEAN and East Asian countries. And now, these challenges have led to uneven impacts. Here we talk about the first. These are 3 challenges, and then the first we talk about the impacts of anti-globalization or protectionism, and also the impacts of US-China trade war, and then we go to impacts of COVID. Let's see. This is right. Okay. Now there are 3, I think, uneven impacts. 3 kinds of uneven impacts of these challenges. One is skilled and unskilled. This is unevenness as to the quality of labor, so to speak. And the second uneven impacts is the large firms versus SMEs. And the third one is a regional disparity, urban versus rural. So for these 3 uneven impacts, of course, I like to argue that the skilled labor get the better impacts, and then than the unskilled. Large firms benefit more than the SMEs, and urban area gain more than the rural area. So these are 3 very important uneven impacts coming from these challenges. And then in addition, there are uneven impacts across or between countries. The developing countries get hurt more seriously than the developed countries. And so this is additional uneven impacts, which is very careful attention. So these are the some of the challenges that we are faced with. And here we like to kind of summarize these uneven impacts or challenges which are caused by particularly pandemic. Yeah, that induced structural transformation. Specifically, these challenges lead to adopting more digital technology, streamlined supply process, and the more technology-intensive skill-based GVC, increased fragmentation of production process, adoption and investment in communication technology, and that, of course, increasing digital communication infrastructure and so on. So these structural changes, which are caused by these challenges, are likely to have a negative impacts on the poor, developing countries, rural area, SMEs. So these are the problem that we need to deal with. Now, ASEAN and RCEP, and as I said earlier, one important answer to these challenges is to use RCEP effectively. And we think, as we heard from other speakers earlier, RCEP can contribute a lot to deal with these challenges or risks. And particularly the impact of RCEP will be significant to ASEAN LDCs, although in terms of maybe absolute value in terms of like GDP, as we heard from, I guess, Professor Park, that CJK maybe gain a lot, but even so, other members of RCEP will gain as well. And here, the gain will be collected by countries in ASEAN, and particularly ASEAN LDCs. And the reason, one of the reasons is that RCEP has a very important feature, which is economic cooperation, which I'll discuss in a minute. And right. Okay, this is the picture showing the RCEP and FTAP and so on. But so now let me go on to the key features of RCEP, which can be used to deal with the challenges, that I just raised. To begin with, trading goods. RCEP has a single rule of origin framework, which should facilitate trade among RCEP countries, and of course, which will promote GVCs. So this is a very important key feature of RCEP, common rules of origin, and the co-sharing of rules of origin. That is, you can have either or, very kind of generous rules of origin framework, and then CJK effect, which again Professor Park emphasized. This is the practical. RCEP gives practically trilateral FTA between China, Japan, Korea, where there is no FTA between Japan and China or Japan and Korea. That'll give a lot of benefits, not only to CJK, but other countries as well. And as I said earlier, RCEP agreement has a key feature for economic cooperation and technical assistance, which can be used by countries like Cambodia and Laos, and to improve human resources and others. Okay, now another key feature is liberalization in services. Importance of services in economic activity has been increasing, and RCEP provides liberalization in services and, of course, in investment, which will contribute to economic growth of the countries involved. All right, then, so these are the, there are other things that I have to mention, key challenges and opportunities. In other words, I emphasize the challenges, but these challenges can be considered as opportunities for RCEP members to take advantage of in order to improve or expand their economic activities. Acceleration of digital and automation could be, of course, it can be a challenge, but at the same time, it's an opportunity to grow. This is digitalization that may have a negative impacts on labor-intensive activities, but if you can use this digital technology effectively, that will contribute to economic growth. And here, economic cooperation and technical assistance is given to developing members of RCEP because they are treated specially and differentially than the other members. And one specific cooperation, which we like to emphasize here, is this a point which Peter Drysdale and Sheila Armstrong mentioned. This is to deal with COVID. RCEP can be a very instrumental framework to provide assistance to the countries which are, of course, suffering from COVID. And RCEP can be used for mass testing and vaccination and so on. So this is a very immediate, maybe, challenge for RCEP to be effective. Finally, I just like to point out the key challenges that the ASEAN and East Asia countries are faced with, particularly developing ASEAN countries. Although digital transformation can be an opportunity, but this is a very important challenge, and that is this weak domestic capacity is very much related to this, and lack of human capital, lack of regulations. These are the challenges that many ASEAN developing countries are faced with. So these are the important points I just like to remind again for these countries to deal with. And let me end with this comment. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Yuttara. It's a very excellent presentation. I think there's some question online. Probably we have some question here as well, but the time is moving. So we keep this question at the end. Anyway, I try to get one question from this room and also one question from online to get to Professor Yuttara, or maybe to the other session, that the next session for chapter number 4. So let me introduce to our distinguished speakers for chapter number 4, called RCEP, Services Liberalization, Key Features and Implication. The speaker, Dr. Romenet Sarifika, is a senior fellow at Philippines Institute for Development Study. She has extensively worked on regional integration and trade and Asian services sector liberalization. Recent paper of Dr. Sarifika include Understanding the Costs and Benefits of Digital Platforms and the Implication of Policy Makings and Regulation. And the second article she published as well, called Costs and Benefits of New Disciplines on Electronic Commerce. The second speaker, Dr. Intan Ramli, is a policy fellow in the Policy Design Department, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN, East Asia, ERIA, in Indonesia since 2018. She provides strategic linkages between ERIA's research and policymakers' requirements in ASEAN and East Asia region. Among her key roles, Intan provides policy research, advice, supports to Asian member states on matters ranging from Asian economic integration, trade services, investment, multilateral trade at WTO, regional free trade agreements, emerging issues like circular economic, technology related to IO 4.0, and also good regulatory practices. Please welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Sarifika and Intan Ramli. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So, Excellencies, distinguished guests, panelists, and participants, good afternoon. Dr. Intan Ramli and I were tasked to review the key features of the Trade in Services chapter of the agreement, examine the implications for services liberalization, and identify the challenges moving forward. Next, please. So in this presentation, I will provide a very brief overview of the importance of services trade in the RCEP region. Next, I will present the main focus of the paper and discuss the key elements of the services chapter. And I will conclude by highlighting what we think are the key challenges ahead. Next, please. So RCEP is the latest and largest preferential trade agreement to recognize the increasing significance of services. From just under a tenth of global trade in 1970, services today account for over a fifth and is likely to grow to a third of world trade by 2040. In terms of cross-border trade, the RCEP region has a mix of net importers and net exporters of services. And RCEP members as a group account for 18% of global services exports. In terms of services covering all modes of supply, based on the estimates of the WTO, RCEP accounts for a fifth of total trade across all four modes, and the same pattern emerges more or less for each mode. Overall, the distribution of services trade of RCEP members closely mirror the world pattern, which is dominated by Mode 3, while Mode 4 represents the smallest share. Of course, at the country level, the patterns would be different. Next slide, please. So to guide the review of the elements or key features of the RCEP chapter on trade in services, we use the template adopted in the World Bank's Handbook of Deep Trade Agreements. And in terms of the structure and scope, similar to GATS, Chapter 8 defines trade in services as a supply of services via the four modes. So you have cross-border supply, consumption abroad, commercial presence, and the presence of natural persons. The chapter also contains 3 sectoral annexes: financial services, telecommunications, and professional services. A separate chapter, Chapter 9, covers measures affecting the temporary entry of natural persons engaged in trade in goods, the supply of services, or the conduct of investment. Now, sectors that are excluded from the coverage of Chapter 8 are the following: services supplied in the exercise of governmental authority, air traffic rights, and air transport services, except for 6 subsectors that are highlighted on the screen. Now, Chapter 8 does not apply or cover government procurement, measures affecting natural persons seeking access to the employment, or measures regarding nationality, citizenship or residence, or employment market on a permanent basis. And it also does not apply to subsidies or grants, including government-supported loans, guarantees, and insurance. Next slide, please. Now, considered the most significant feature of the RCEP services chapter compared to other FTAs of ASEAN is the scheduling of commitments. Parties are to use the negative list approach either on the date of entry into force or within a defined period. Members that initially chose the positive list approach prepared schedules using a format that is similar to GATS, whereby limitations on market access and national treatment are inscribed for each service subsector included. In the negative list approach, exemptions with respect to the liberalization obligations of national treatment, market access, most favored nation treatment, and local presence are listed in the schedules of reservations and non-conforming measures. And services that are not listed in the schedules are considered fully open. Next slide, please. So countries that have initially prepared their commitments using the positive list approach in order to transition to a negative list were Cambodia, China, Lao PDR, Myanmar, New Zealand, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. And these countries shall submit a proposed schedule of non-conforming measures, which should reflect an equivalent or a greater level of liberalization. The transition process involves the preparation, verification, clarification, and adoption of the schedules, including completion of applicable domestic processes. It should be noted that ASEAN Trade in Services Agreement, or TISA, signed in 2020, adopts the negative list approach as well, and it provides for a transition of the final AFAS commitments, which have been scheduled using the GATS type positive list scheduling, and ASEAN should also transition to a negative list schedule of reservations. Next slide, please. Okay, so the negative list approach is seen to reduce uncertainty and provide greater transparency on the current services regime by listing down all non-conforming measures. In List A, members may continue to maintain the limitations identified, which reflect the current regulatory regime. Moreover, any future changes in the measures listed cannot be more restrictive. Thus, standstill and ratchet provisions apply to List A, wherein a member binds the existing level of restrictiveness based on the current regulation and commits not to backtrack, such that any amendment can only be towards further liberalization. Now, in List B, a member maintains full reservation in subsectors or activities included. This means that a member cannot keep existing measures that, or rather can keep existing measures that do not conform to the foreign liberalization obligations and may even introduce new limitations. A member also reserves the right to impose future measures that may be more restrictive than current regulations. So these features are not unique to the scheduling technique and can be introduced whether in a positive or negative list approach. And to some extent, the perceived advantages of the negative list approach are approximated in the positive list approach as indicated in the second column of this table. So as to which approach is more liberalizing, it has been argued by experts that substance matters more than form. A negative list approach does not automatically lead to greater liberalization, as reservations can be used to exclude a broad range of measures from meaningful liberalization. In theory, both the positive and the negative list approach can be used to attain the same level of liberalization, and what matters are the commitments and the limitations in the positive list, as well as the reservations in the negative list. Next slide, please. So as in the GATS, transparency is also an unconditional general obligation in RCEP, which applies even to sectors that are not included in the respective schedules. The chapter contains an obligation to promptly publish all relevant laws and regulations affecting services trade, as well as relevant international agreements. Now, for sectors included in a member schedule, measures of general application affecting services trade must be administered in a reasonable, objective, and impartial manner. Members must also set up judicial, arbitral, or administrative tribunals or procedures for the prompt review and possible remedies for administrative decisions. RCEP also requires that members exert best efforts to ensure that for sectors included in their schedules, such measures are based on objective and transparent criteria, not more burdensome than is necessary to ensure the quality of the service, and in the case of licensing procedures, not in themselves a trade restriction. There are also disciplines imposed on the regulator, such as an obligation for the competent authority to inform applicants on the decision or the status of the application, and to ensure that the decisions are made within a reasonable period. Next slide. So the chapter also contains provisions on anti-competitive business practices and monopolies. In terms of other policy objectives, similar to GATS, RCEP members can restrict trade in specific cases, regardless of obligations made. Examples of such circumstances include the protection of public morals, or to maintain public order, the protection of human, animal, or plant life or health, national security, and balance of payments difficulties. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide in terms of the challenges and way forward. So an immediate challenge in our view is the transition to the negative list scheduling approach. Since LDCs in particular were not required to prepare a transparency list, the conduct of a trade-related regulatory audit would be a good starting point. A proper regulatory audit must go beyond the mechanical exercise of identifying non-conforming measures, but also examine the underlying rationale for the regulations and doing so would facilitate the important step of identifying the list of reservations and sensitive sectors. The negative list could still result in limited liberalization via a long list of reservations, as I mentioned earlier. And at the same time, a lack of understanding or coordination in government, among other things, could result in countries unintentionally opening up sectors or giving up policy space. Thus, a thorough evaluation and coordination among government agencies is needed. A clear vision for the services sector in the development agenda will also serve as a useful guide in determining the liberalization objectives and sensitivities. Now, another challenge would be in relation to plugging regulatory deficits. Countries may have difficulties implementing the requirements with respect to transparency and domestic regulation. Equally important, and in some cases possibly more critical, is the identification of missing regulations or regulatory authorities to support well-functioning markets. So, for example, the Annex on Telecommunications sets the obligations to ensure that the gains from market access commitments are not negated by the lack of pro-competition regulations or the absence of an independent authority. In general, sound regulations and institutions are especially important for ensuring good quality infrastructure services. Now, finally, developing countries might also face capacity constraints to be able to maximize the advantages of the market access given by the RCEP partners. The chapter contains specific provisions to assist members on increasing the participation of least developed country parties and on cooperation. There's also a chapter on SMEs and economic and technical cooperation. And this should be considered in ensuring that LDCs will benefit well from the agreement. Now, to better target support for building capacities, it would be useful to determine the export interests of each country. For example, the Trade Integration Strategy of Cambodia has identified several sectors that are part of its strategy for export diversification. For example, legal services, IT-enabled services, animation, banking services, entertainment services, and tourism services. So technical assistance could be focused on alleviating the supply constraints in these subsectors and also addressing the regulatory bottlenecks. So that concludes my presentation, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sarifika and Dr. Intan for detailed presentation. So it still have like 5 to 10 minutes. Is it fine? Because the time is 12:30, we finished by that time, but can we extend 10 minutes? So for 5 to 10 minutes, I give a floor to our participant here. Could you have any question? Please provide your name to our speaker and also organization, and direct question to our distinguished speaker. Thank you. Do you have any question, Excellency? All right. So in our room, we don't have a specific question. So let me just ask one question to Dr. Sarifika. The chapter on services have carefully evaluated RCEP with other FTAs in the regions. One of the key features of RCEP is the shift from positive list to approaches to negative list approach in services liberalization. How important is the negative list approach, and what are challenges for RCEP and Asian member moving to the negative approach? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that question. So the key principle in the negative list approach is list or lose. So in other words, if you do not identify the measure or the service subsector that where limitations need to be maintained based on your assessment of your priorities, then this will be assumed to be open. So therefore, the first step, as I've mentioned, is really to produce a detailed inventory of all the non-conforming measures in your regulatory environment, and then identify which ones are in the list A, which means that you have to bind them at the current regulatory practice. And I think equally important, or perhaps most important, is really defining your list of reservations, which is called the list B, because in effect, this is where ultimate or your policy space can be exercised. But at the same time, because there's a trade-off that you have to consider, your service suppliers, of course, they would be interested in gaining market access, in non-discriminatory treatment, in transparency of your regulatory environment, and in reducing uncertainty. So these concerns from your business community will have to be balanced by your need for policy space to attain your ultimate objective. And that is why I think also fundamentally you should start with a clear vision of what services, of the role of services in your development agenda, so that you can weigh these two interests from the business or the industry side and government side. So I hope that responds to your question.
Yeah, thank you very much for your answer. Because of this time, so let me conclude for the session today. We finished by 12:38. So for any question, could be reached to Dr. Uttara and Dr. Sarafika by email or by Zoom. So online participant can receive the answer respectively. Thank you.